And tonight we are delighted to welcome Aerin Fogel, who is a Toronto-based astrologer, and she also works with core pattern recognition in people and charts, and a tarot reader. And core pattern readings are channeled readings that look at people's repetitive life patterns. They sound absolutely fascinating, and the astrology supports that, of course. And her astrological perspective bridges traditional Hellenistic and modern and mythic astrology. And she specializes in mythic and family astrology through an intergenerational lens. She has spoken widely for OPA, ISAR, the AA Conference, lectured for Kepler College, and also appeared on the Astrology Podcast and blogs for the Mountain Astrologer. But as well as somehow managing to do all this, she also has a band called the Queen of Swords, which sounds really exciting. And tonight her talk is entitled The Eighth House, Initiating the Tipping Point. So it's about, looks at the eighth as a deep realm of experience where fear begins, which can either betray life or catapult us into an enriching journey of self and intimacy. So over to you, Aerin, and we're all really excited to listen to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you everyone for being here, and Aquarius Southern for having me. I'm an Aquarius Sun, so I feel right at home in your organization. So I will go right ahead and start sharing my slides here. Okay, and everyone can see this, yeah? Great. So, as you hopefully know by now, we're going to be talking about the eighth house. If that seems like a nightmare, you're welcome to duck out at any point. But I am hoping to take us past the initial reactions to the eighth house that, tell us a lot about what's in there in the first place. So, needless to say, there will probably be some mention of sensitive or challenging topics. So again, you are welcome to do whatever you need for yourself at any point given that. And the first thing that I'd like to say is that we all have an eighth house. Often I work with clients all day. That's my sort of 9 to 5. And often I get people coming to me with questions about this or that house that's empty. And they're wondering if that means that therefore it's not part of their lives or it's not important in their lives. And that's certainly not the case. We all contain each sign of the zodiac and each house of the chart within us. And whether or not you have planets or placements in the eighth house, it's going to be relevant for all of us in some way. So these themes apply to everyone. Of course, if you do have planets or placements there, it may add a little bit of extra emphasis, especially if they are one of the luminaries or, something really prominent like your ascendant ruler. But if you do not, I would encourage you to think about the ruler of your eighth house, and we'll get a little bit more into that as we get towards the end. I also have no idea what the astrology level or level of down the astrology rabbit hole people are in this Zoom room here today. So I've geared the talk to be accessible to everyone, at least from a symbolic standpoint. And then, whatever astrology jargon is in there, feel free to just take what you understand and don't worry about the rest. So we will talk more about the actual meaning or the more technical delineations of the eighth house sort of in the second half. But first I want to start by just giving a sense of what the eighth house is, because I find that when people are learning astrology, they're often just getting fragmented pieces of information, and it can become like a process of almost memorization. Like this means this, and the eighth house means this, and Mars means this. But we're often not brought into an understanding of why or where those meanings come from. And so that's part of what I'm hoping to offer you today. Which is all to say that for me, astrology is very much an embodied experience. It's a mythic experience, and it's a relational experience. When we are looking at a chart and the houses in the chart, what we are actually doing is looking at our embodied perspective of the sky, right? Like we use the location because we're anchoring ourselves in a particular place in the earth and then recreating what we would be able to see in the sky from that perspective of planet Earth. So that's embodied, right? And it is mythic because, as far as we understand, astrology began 4,000 or 5,000 years ago with people basically looking up at the sky, observing what was happening, and then giving symbol to that or giving story to what they observed. And it is, of course, relational because as astrologers, we understand as above, so below, that we are part of a much larger related ecosystem, that we are impacted by everything that happens around us. So much as we understand our relationship to the sun, the moon, and the planets, we also can take that relational framework into our understanding of what the houses mean, of what the planets mean in relation to one another. So I do find that without that context, it's all just kind of like random memorization. And so hopefully we can get a little bit underneath that today. So here's my very technical recreation of what the eighth house is when we are talking about it from an embodied perspective. This here, this little orange globe, that's what I'm taking to represent the sun, and we see it placed there in the eighth house in this image. And so from an embodied perspective, this is a chart wheel. We have the horizon line running back and forth here. Hopefully you can see my pointer. We have the meridian line that runs up and down and gives us the midheaven and the IC. And the eighth house itself is where the sun, moon, and planets begin to fall towards the horizon. They are still part of the visible sky. They're above the horizon, but they are beginning to fall. So I'm sure that some of you are familiar with the two kinds of motion that we have in astrology. We've got primary and secondary, also known as diurnal and zodiacal. And primary motion refers to the process of the sun, moon, and planets rising on the eastern horizon, moving up towards the midheaven, kind of culminating at the top of the sky, and then they move to set in the western horizon, and then they eventually go under the earth and back around again. So that is the direction that we call diurnal or primary, as things are rising, culminating, and setting. And I'm sure if you are practicing astrology, you've noticed that secondary or zodiacal motion actually appears to move the opposite way. So that if something is moving through the signs of the zodiac, it's moving in the opposite direction as something that's rising in the east, setting in the west. And that's because we've got the earth spinning on its axis and then also moving around the sun. And that's where we get those two kinds of motion from. So here we have two ways to go through the houses, primary and secondary. And I find that secondary motion is primarily what's taught, especially if we're talking about the houses. It seems natural. We're going to start at 1, we're going to go to 2, 3, 4, etc. We're going to land on 12. That's kind of like the usual process. But personally, I find that way more makes sense if we go the other way. If we start with diurnal motion and we're moving in the other direction, we start to have an embodied understanding of why each house means what it means. And then we can layer other things on top of that, such as the planetary joys and stuff like that. Diurnal motion corresponds more towards the early Egyptian roots of astrology, whereas secondary motion corresponds a little bit more towards the early Mesopotamian roots of astrology. And we understand that those, as far as we know at this time, historically, those were our two sort of primary origins of astrology. And then they converged during the Hellenistic era, where we had this like sudden birth of natal astrology and this like explosion of astrological wisdom happening in the Hellenistic period. And now the way that we use astrology, we want both. We want diurnal and we want secondary motion for our true understanding of what's going on. So here's again my very technical drawing of how things get to the 8th house. Here's the sun rising over here in the east, and then we see it moves up through the 12th, the 11th, up here in the 10th. It culminates at the midheaven, and then it starts to move towards the 8th. It's still visible, but it is beginning to move towards the horizon. So the 8th is where something begins to fall from the day and realize that night is coming as the sun begins to set in this place. So where I am, we just had the summer solstice here in the northern hemisphere. So by the time the sun gets to the 8th house around this time of year, it might be like 6, 7 o'clock in the evening. And we still have a couple hours of day left, but in the winter, when the sun gets to the 8th house, it's like 3 p.m. here or something. It happens very early. So ancient astrologers actually considered this place, the 8th house, to be the entrance to the underworld. And this held a profound symbolism for especially the Egyptian astrologers, because they would use this symbolism of the sun as the god Ra. And they believed that the sun god Ra would enter the underworld roughly when it got to the 8th house in the sky, and then begin every single night this underworld journey where it would cross into the darkness and experience rebirth in those dark places when the sun is under the earth. And then when it would rise in the eastern horizon again, it would be reborn. So the underworld within the chart is represented by this journey of the sun through the day and the night. So we can take this 8th house place as the place in the sky where the sun begins to descend. So it's like an entrance to the darkness. And that's why we call it the entrance. It's not in the darkness yet. Nothing is actually in that darkness till it gets to the 6th house under the horizon. And that's a different talk. In the 8th house, we're just entering. So the sun begins to set as it enters the underworld, and then it moves through those underworld houses, down through 6, 5, 4. And then the 3rd house is actually the last house in what we would call the symbolic underworld before things emerge into the 2nd, also known as the gate of Hades, just before they rise on the ascendant once more. So since that 8th house is the place where we begin to enter the darkness and leave the clear visibility of day, I think it is best accessed and understood through symbol, which is, how we can kind of feel our way in the dark. So I'm going to share a myth now, one of the traditional Greek myths that we can use as a symbol for the 8th house. And you're welcome to just kind of follow along or zone out as you like. But I'd encourage you to see if there's any particular feelings or thoughts that arise as we're kind of going through this story. So I'm sure some of you read the Odyssey at some point, like maybe way back in university. We're going to use a moment from the Odyssey. Don't worry if you have never read this, you don't know anything about it. We're just taking kind of a fragment out of it. And the moment that we are taking out of the Odyssey is chronologically the beginning of the story, although most of the Greek myths are told chaotically out of order. You get these different pieces, but if we put it A to Z chronologically, this would sort of be at the beginning. So it's a tipping point of the rest of the story. And this is a place where Odysseus and his men, they've just left the War of Troy. And this has been very successful, at least for people on that side of the war. And all of the war heroes are ready to go home with their sort of triumph and their heroic celebration, and they're all going to set sail and go home to their families. So Odysseus and his crew leave Troy, and their first stop on the way home is they land on this island. They're super hungry, and they're like, okay, what can we find here? It turns out to be the island of the Cyclopes, who in the myths are these gargantuan giant beings with one eye. So they are cyclopses, called the Cyclopes, and they're extremely creative beings. They actually make a lot of the important materia that are used by the gods in many of the stories. But they're kind of cranky. They're not the most hospitable. So Odysseus and his men land on this island. They're looking for food, and they find themselves in the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus. And they ask him for hospitality, which is kind of like a traditional Greek thing in that era. You would show up somewhere and usually you would be fed and housed, before any questions were asked. It was like this extension of the home and hospitality towards strangers. They ask Polyphemus for hospitality, and not only does he refuse, but he's like, oh, good, my dinner is here. And he starts to eat some of the men. Naturally, they are horrified, but it's a little bit too late. And he's much bigger than they are, and they're already in his cave. And he closes them into the cave with this giant boulder. So Odysseus right away is like, well, we can't just kill him because we are not strong enough to open that boulder. Like, we need his physical strength to move the boulder again so we can actually get out of this cave. So he starts to scheme. And they pull out this wine that they have, and Polyphemus is like continuing to eat the men through the night. It's a perilous situation. They fear for their lives, but they also give him this very strong wine that they have with them. And he's pretty into that. So he drinks a lot of this wine. He gets pretty drunk. He starts chatting it up with them. And he even asks, like, okay, what's your name? Tell me your name. And Odysseus says, my name is nobody. He doesn't want him to know who he has in his cave. He's like, I'm going to play it anonymous. My name is nobody. Eventually, Polyphemus, he's a bit drunk. He falls asleep. And this is when Odysseus and his men take a giant stick that they've found in the cave, and they pierce Polyphemus through his single Cyclops eye, blinding him and, of course, waking him up instantly. And he begins to scream and thrash about. And all the Cyclops neighbors come running to outside the cave, and they're like, Polyphemus, are you okay? What's going on? And he's like, nobody is trying to kill me, because this is what he thinks Odysseus's name is. So they're like, oh, okay, you're good. And, they leave him and they go back to sleep. So no help can be found. The next morning, poor Polyphemus wakes up, he's now blinded in his one eye, but he's like, I gotta let my sheep out of the cave. They gotta go out to the pasture as they do every day. So he starts to roll the boulder back to open the mouth of the cave to let the sheep go out. But little does he know that Odysseus and his men have attached themselves to the bellies of the sheep, like they're kind of clinging on to the sheep from the underside. So as the sheep go out to pasture, Polyphemus is like feeling around to make sure that the men are not sneaking out of the cave, but he doesn't think to check the underside of the sheep. And so Odysseus and his men successfully escape, and they run down to their ship, and they get on the ship and they kick off, and they're starting to, crest away from the shore. And Odysseus cannot resist himself for taking credit for this like brilliant plan that he had. And so as they're leaving the shore, he calls back at Polyphemus, it wasn't nobody that harmed you. It was I, Odysseus. Like, he has to take credit. And Polyphemus is like enraged. He cannot see anything anymore, but he's taking these boulders and hurling these giant boulders at the ship and at the men, trying to sink them with these rocks. And he calls upon his father. And oh, plot twist, he happens to be the son of Poseidon, who is the god of the seas. And he calls upon his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus and his men. And of course, Daddy Poseidon obliges. And so thus begins the story of the Odyssey, because the actual story of the Odyssey is a 10-year tale of Poseidon thwarting Odysseus at every single turn so that he cannot return home. And that trip home from the war should have been just a couple months. and it turns into 10 years of profound loss and seeking and loneliness and trial and isolation, but ultimately like a very profound and meaningful process of self-discovery and ultimately a return at the end of it. So I've included here, as we move into analyzing this myth a little bit, some questions that we might say are from the eighth house. Because from the perspective of Polyphemus, we might wonder like what he's thinking and feeling in this story. Or perhaps for ourselves in our own eighth house, where do we feel shameful or misbehaved or bad or inhospitable? Have we felt like a monster? Or have we felt like we've been tricked by these heroic figures? Has our vision been obscured the way it is for Polyphemus? Have we perhaps felt powerless and helpless and resorted to throwing curses where we had no other agency? From the perspective of Odysseus, on the other hand, the quote unquote hero of this story, what is he thinking and feeling? And in our eighth house, are we trying to overcome a monster? Or do we see ourselves as the hero that's conquering this monster? And then, like Odysseus, do we end up paying some kind of great price where we just thought that we had gotten away, where we just thought we succeeded? Or do we pay some kind of price for wanting credit for our efforts? And then also this question of how we need to use invisibility to survive. So really, it's this particular event that initiates the whole story of the Odyssey, as I said. As a symbol for the eighth house, this becomes the initiation or the tipping point of a very long journey that precedes the goal of actually arriving home. If we take the first house to represent some kind of home, then we understand that the eighth house is the tipping point that initiates the whole underworld journey that takes place before we get back to that place of home at the ascendant. So it is my opinion that we actually cannot really understand the first house or the 12th house, which might be like our traditional starting places if we're going around the houses, without first understanding the tipping point and the journey that actually leads us home to the ascendant. So the eighth house is like this tipping point into the underworld. Just as for Odysseus, it's where he tips over from being this kind of glorified war hero, what we might imagine as his like 10th house personality. He won the War of Troy and he's this big hero. But as he gets to the eighth house, that identity or that personality starts to tip over into something that involves loss and grief, but also healing and self-discovery and eventually a homecoming. It's particularly interesting to me that they have to work with the monster rather than killing him. We might say they exploit the monster, not actually like working with him in a collaborative way, but they can't just get rid of him because they would not be able to escape the cave themselves. And I would say a cave is kind of like an eighth house environment to begin with. So this is how they're able to leave in this almost like vulnerable way, like this image of them on the soft underbellies of the sheep. Like it's such a symbol of vulnerability for me that's actually how we exit the eighth house is when we're like on our backs in this vulnerable place. But we have to have some kind of working with the monster to actually get there. From the other perspective, the parts of us that might feel monstrous may also have been exploited here in the eighth house as Polyphemus is, or a place where others exploit us for their own gain or sense of heroicism and freedom. Or perhaps those more monstrous feeling parts of us are simply demonized or wounded by the heroic figures. And, as I pointed out, Odysseus is more manipulating the monster rather than working with him, which to me explains why it's not a true escape. It comes back on him threefold in the end. He's not really free. There's a whole other process still to unfold there. So this is also where scapegoating can become a very relevant theme in the eighth house. When we label something as monstrous, we're saying, I'm not that. That other thing is bad and I'm good. And then we free ourselves from the bad thing. So this is also a place in the chart where we're fielding projection from others or the parts of themselves that they're trying to be free from. And perhaps at times we, especially people with a strong eighth house emphasis, may be blinded or debilitated by this, just like Polyphemus was. And as I said, we can see that Odysseus is not truly freed. These actions become more of a curse for him in the end. So there are huge themes around consumption with the eighth house too. The men land on this island in the first place because they're hungry and they're looking for food and they're expecting to be fed and they're expecting to be kind of hosted. But then we see also Polyphemus has this like unstoppable desire to consume as well. As soon as someone shows up on his doorstep, the first response is to swallow them whole, like, oh, good, something for me to take in. So we might also say the eighth house is a place of insatiable hunger that is represented by this tipping point where the sun begins to be swallowed by the horizon, embodied by Polyphemus kind of swallowing these men whole, and also embodied by that entitlement from Odysseus and his men where they're expecting to have something to swallow themselves. It's worth also mentioning the strong wine that is part of this story. For so many people, that hunger of the eighth house, that desire to take in life or to consume it with this voracity, can be unbearable. And it is often through substances that numb us or to help us dissociate in a way that actually allows some level of coping or functioning with life, when we cannot otherwise tolerate that desire, that insatiability of the eighth house. So it's my feeling that the eighth house needs a little bit of like working. We need to work with it a bit, or it is something that can swallow us whole, especially depending on the placements that are there. Another interesting symbol to me is this piercing through the eye of the Cyclops. First of all, the Cyclops itself as a being that has one eye, like perhaps this kind of singular or more unified type of vision or perception. And then that singular vision being pierced through and obscured. So we might say that in order to leave the eighth house or that cave in which we are swallowed, there's some kind of perception that must be pierced through in order to leave. So I would say that perception is a key to working through eighth house challenges, and not seeing or not perceiving is also one of the central challenges of the eighth house for that same reason. So you may remember that Odysseus initially identifies himself to the Cyclops as nobody, signifying that in the eighth house, we begin to lose our secure self-identity that might exist before that in the 10th, in the 9th. And in the 8th, we begin to descend into this place of night, which is multiple. It's not as visible. It's not as clear and cohesive. But in the end, the whole journey of loss that he goes through takes place because he actually resists just being nobody. He has to like restake his claim on his identity. And so therefore Polyphemus knows exactly who his father should curse. And it's, always just a little interesting to me that the Odyssey is essentially a story of like a long, bad Neptune transit, because Poseidon would be Neptune in our planetary significations. And the Odyssey lasts a little longer than 10 years, which is like almost the amount of time that Neptune would spend in any sign. So at this point, we see Odysseus kind of coming out of that place of the war hero in the 11th and the 10th, and beginning this process of loss, where he comes back to something transformed on the other side. Really, this need to identify himself is what becomes his downfall, as we can see. And the 8th house can become this place of shame, like a liminal space between ourselves and others. Just like Polyphemus is portrayed as this kind of shameful being, right? Like he's inhospitable, he's eating the men, he loves to drink strong wine. He's this really bad host. And he's seen as a monstrous being by the Greeks. His actions are, uncultured or seemingly monstrous to them according to their customs. So this notion of a monster that we have culturally is defined by those shameful projections that lurk in the 8th house. This involves his perceived wrongful actions like that hunger, his drinking, killing the men. Arguably, if we look at it from the other perspective, the actions of Odysseus and his men could be considered just as monstrous, right? Like Polyphemus is just at home, minding his own business, hungry for dinner, and these men show up and demand to be fed and eventually blind him and, steal his sheep in the process. So these are worthy symbols for our 8th house experience, both the one that's seen as bad and wrong and a thing to be conquered, and the one that is doing the conquering and overcoming this badness. So we see that transfer of projection happening in the 8th house, where Odysseus pins Polyphemus as like a central monster of this whole story. But really, the 8th house is also a place of initiation, which means that in this story, Odysseus is being initiated into the journey ahead. So all of these themes, the hunger, the shame, the monstrousness, the difficult circumstances that are beyond our control, putting a little asterisk next to difficult circumstances beyond our control, which is also the stuff of the 8th house. This becomes an initiation or a tipping point into a much deeper exploration through that underworld. So when we finally do arrive home, it's a completely different kind of homecoming after such a deep journey. And Polyphemus trying to sink their ship with these boulders is a strong symbol for the kind of fear that the 8th house can generate, like where we're afraid of being sunk by the monster. And that fear is one of the dominant features of the 8th house. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with people who come into a consultation and they're like, I have a really strong 8th house. Is that bad? Or, are bad things going to happen to me? But they're just speaking the language of the 8th house. The fear that they're bad or the fear that something is bad is the 8th house. It's not an indication of something else altogether. So it is the monster that initiates this journey for them. And it is a symbolic journey that ultimately leads to awakening. And that journey is one in which the fears are faced and overcome rather than ultimately becoming destructive themselves. So what we fear in the 8th house is maybe being sunk by rocks or these things that are out of our control. But instead, what we have the option to do, there's always going to be things out of our control. We all have an 8th house, meaning that we all experience loss. We all experience things that happen to us that contain fear. It's part of being human. But we have also this capacity to see where we are being initiated in the process. It is worth mentioning that death is also both a reality and a symbol of the 8th house. And I think this is also, what a lot of the fear is connected to. Because there is death in this story that we're looking at, right? Like there are many men that are eaten. There are less of them that leave the cave than go in the first place. And the whole plot of the story is motivated by this fear of death and the need to survive, which is a fundamental human experience, both for Polyphemus as well as for Odysseus and his men. So yes, there are associations with the eighth house and death, and those are, levels of reality that are often going to pertain to the things that are outside of our control. So in the meantime, we can consider symbolic death as information about how we're living. Like, how does that fear of death motivate so much of the plotline of our lives? So we'll just look quickly now at a little eighth house example. One of my favorites, the wonderful Tim Burton. Most people probably know who he is, but if you don't, he's an incredible filmmaker and director, famous for his sort of like gothic, I don't even know how to describe his style. It's very gothic, kind of like these otherworldly beings and often like monsters and creatures. And he's famous for movies like Beetlejuice, Nightmare Before Christmas, Edward Scissorhands, a few of the Batman movies, things like that. So we see here that Tim Burton has Moon in Capricorn in the eighth house, and it is squaring Jupiter and the lunar nodes. And we also can see that the ruler of the eighth house, which is Saturn, is angular in the seventh house as well. So Tim Burton is known for humanizing monsters. So if we're going to look at the way this like symbol or this myth that we've just explored actually works in a real life example, this feels like the perfect one to me. This is someone who has spent his whole life and career offering us humanized, empathetic portrayal of these beings that otherwise are considered monstrous. We have characters like Edward Scissorhands or Jack from Nightmare Before Christmas, who are like these demonized characters in the community. People fear them, they think that they're bad and awful. But through their portrayal in the story, we perhaps feel compassion or see them as something else altogether. We see their heart, we see their care. And it's interesting to me also that many of Tim Burton's films actually show things that are like entrances to the underworld. For those of you that have seen Beetlejuice, like there's almost like this underworld entrance in the attic itself. And there's a version of that in Nightmare Before Christmas too. Or even like the Penguin's lair in Batman feels like it feels like a kind of underworldly place that can be entered by the hero. So he is showing us these themes, first of all, around fear, how fear can be worked with, how the heroes relate to these fearful, monstrous characters, but also how this becomes a tipping point into a whole other kind of understanding or sense of identity. So I would say Tim Burton is essentially making modern day versions of the Polyphemus story, but perhaps told much more through Polyphemus's perspective than through Odysseus's. So coming back to this moon in Capricorn here, his early life experience, he grew up in like a very suburban kind of like normie cultured small town, in which he like entirely did not fit in. And so he describes his childhood as feeling very, very alienated, very othered. He did not fit in with like the sort of normal culture that was there. And this was a source of pain and alienation for him. So we see that through the moon in detriment in Capricorn, squaring Jupiter and the lunar nodes, that loneliness and difficulty of his childhood. And we can think of that Jupiter North Node in Libra as like the sort of culture that's around him, right? Like there's an expectation that should be met of what it is to fit in, of what it is to belong. And he, as the moon in Capricorn up there in the eighth, is at odds with this. However, it's worth noting that the moon, first of all, this is a night chart. It has triplicity in Capricorn, but the moon is also enclosed by the benefics. So it's separating from that square to Jupiter, and its next application with the traditional planets would be in opposition to Venus. So this tells us that although this is something that's been extremely difficult for him, ultimately this is where his gifts emerge from as well, and it is something that he will become successful with, even though it's a great challenge to have overcome. So we can imagine, given his own life experience in this kind of normative environment, he's someone who self-describes as being neurodivergent and on the autism spectrum, that in that growing up experience, he himself may have felt monstrous in some way, or like Polyphemus among the Greek culture and their rules of engagement, and that fear that comes with misunderstanding and isolation, but that this also becomes his tipping point into initiation of self and all that beautiful visionary creativity that his moon has expressed through his work. So now I'd like to take some of all that like fragmented information that I mentioned in the beginning, like these bits of information that you might have about the eighth house, and see if we can weave a more embodied understanding of that together with the symbols that we've just looked at. So traditionally, the eighth house is called the idle place, and it's considered to be an inactive house. And as I mentioned, it's where the sun begins to fall towards the horizon, as the Egyptians saw it, as the place where the sun god Ra began to enter the underworld. So a large aspect of the eighth house's association with death is because of this. It's where the Egyptians saw the sun crossing over to begin its death and ultimate rebirth before rising on the eastern horizon once more. The eighth house also undoes the unified sense of self that is best achieved just before in the ninth house for the sun, right? The sun joys in the ninth house. It's comfortable there, it's cohered, the sense of self is strong. And then this starts to fragment and fray as the sun crosses this initiation into the death realms. So we might also think of the eighth house as a death of our personality self or our individual self, which has come to be more visible and recognized in the 10th or in the 9th and doesn't want to be undone by the underworld. Excuse me, my printer made a few extra pages here for some reason. And it is also the first interpersonal house that we encounter as we move diurnally, right? Like if we're coming out of the 12th, 11th, 10th, those are all collective houses. There's other people there, but they're big group processes. And then we get to the 8th, and all of a sudden, oh, it's just me and you. Like it has this intimacy to it. And that's the first time we encounter that interpersonal place if we're going diurnally. So for those of you who do work with the planetary joys, the delineations of the 8th also come from it being the place where the sun falls from its joy. So this sense of self and success is most felt in the 9th house for the sun, and the 8th is where it falls from grace, right? Like the 9th is also called the place of God. And so it's like falling from the grace of God as the sun gets into the 8th house and starts to fragment. And this death is also representative of a house that does not see or make any aspect to the first house and the ascendant. So not only are we falling or tipping over in the 8th house, but we cannot access the sense of self that is present in the first house. We're falling without some kind of anchor. So it threatens to undo the sense of self from the ascendant as well. And this is the discomfort of the dark houses, or the houses that don't see the ascendant, is that whatever is happening there is outside the perception and access of the ascendant. So it's a place where we lose our sight. We think back to the Polyphemus symbol. And that's something that inspires fear, right? We can't see where we're going here. And this is also why it becomes a house of mysticism and initiation, or these processes that require us to fall out of our more solar or organized sense of self into something that's not visible, that's not immediately obvious, or that we can only really reach through our peripheral vision. So it can be a house of literal death, but it is primarily a death of our sense of self that lives at the ascendant that's happening here. So I consider the 4th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house as these more right brain spaces. And that's maybe a whole other talk in and of itself. But if we're looking at the 8th house as one of those right brain spaces, like one that's more intuitive or sensing, feeling, remembering, the 8th house is the relational right brain space. It's between us and the other. And so this is also why it is often associated with the occult, with ritual, with initiation, and with the mysteries. Because we tip below that regular place of consciousness and we enter this liminal space between ourselves and another, where something has begun to fall into the realm below and be initiated. Therefore, these are also places where we can start to access spirit or the occult and the ancestral realms. In these liminal spaces where our individual sense of self can start to make way for something else to enter in. And it's worth saying that all mythic journeys have some kind of initiation to them, right? Like every myth begins with a problem or a loss or something that starts the quest in the first place. And this is the beginning of where we confront our true humanity and what lies under the surface. So we see that perfectly in Odysseus's story as well. You know, he loses everything in the process, but his homecoming is profoundly special in a way it may not have been if it was 10 years earlier. Many people know about the 8th house as a place of shared resource and inheritance. That's one of the more like pragmatic pieces of it, or perhaps like the less ephemeral delineations of the 8th. As a place of shared resource, we can think about it as the 2nd house from the 7th, right? So we have that like derived interpretation of like our partner's money or the money of people that we are in business with or something like that. It can also indicate inherited money or also inherited debt. People talk about like inherited money a lot of the time, but it's inheritance of any kind, essentially. And sometimes that helps us and sometimes that hinders us. Resources that have either come through other people or that go through to other people as well in that shared interpersonal way. So sometimes we see people with strong 8th houses either inheriting money or inheriting debt or distributing their money to others or managing or acquiring money on behalf of others. So we do see people like accountants, bankers with strong 8th house placements, but we also see people like grant writers, people who work in not-for-profits, in charitable organizations, and they become this sort of funnel of the money is not theirs to begin with, and it's kind of coming in one end and out the other and being funneled over to other people. And we can similarly translate this understanding of shared resource to something that is about shared energy or acquired or inherited traits and feelings as well. So a strong 8th house emphasis can also indicate emotional or psychic inheritance from one's family, or even I've seen at times like physically inherited conditions as well. especially things that relate to eighth house themes, such as the unseen or perceived monstrous aspects of the lineage. It is often the person in the family with the strong eighth house who ends up inheriting or, sort of being confronted with these larger themes of the family that may have not been addressed in the past. So, in this way, an individual can become an embodiment of the Polyphemus-like family stories, with the rest of the family trying to, shun them or shame them or banish them in an Odysseus-like heroic way. We can see eighth housers sometimes as black sheep who embody monstrousness that others try to overcome. And of course, it doesn't mean that they are monstrous. It means that there's something that's kind of been left with them in a way. Or we see eighth house people becoming more like Odysseus, where they obtain this heroic story of overcoming the monstrous family, only to potentially feel cursed anyways as they flee the scene. As we know, these are not really things that can be escaped. So the eighth house really allows us to see, again, the relational component to it. I was speaking about this like relational aspect in the beginning, that it's not like there's a good or bad side of this story, but that the roles are related, and the story that plays out between Polyphemus and Odysseus is highly related. I also think about it as the subconscious of the people that we are close to, and these unseen or intangible things that surface after we've gotten close to someone or after we've made an agreement. So we've looked at it diurnally as this place of like tipping into the darkness or the underworld. But if we look at it the other way through secondary motion, we're coming from the seventh house into the eighth house. And that's how most people learn it, right? So we might say that from that perspective, we make a commitment or we form an agreement or we build something. And then there are all these sometimes surprising, deeper entanglements that emerge after the fact of that commitment in the eighth house. It's the, oh, I didn't see that in there until I really got in deep. The eighth house is also often circumstance, as I mentioned earlier. And this is a really important piece because I hope to be offering a way for us to work with our eighth house, but also an understanding that, like, there's so many things in our life that are out of our control, especially usually the challenging themes. And so we often find those themes in the eighth house, the things that are challenging that we didn't initiate, but that initiate us. And so it can feel like something is done to us in the eighth house, right? Like something that happens in the peripheries of our experience from the perspective of the ascendant. But as part of our chart, we can also recognize that as a function of the self. Super traditional astrologers would argue me on this point, and that's okay, right? Because there's that perspective that like the eighth house is not us, it's other things or things that are outside of us. But my point would be that, if we're understanding ourselves to be relational beings, there's really not so much separation. So what is happening out there is also happening in here as well. So we can have some curiosity in the eighth house about what we might be enacting or how we engage things subconsciously with other people, how we maybe engage these taboo themes in life. So for instance, if we're someone who has ever felt scapegoated, we're going to see that in our eighth house. Or for someone who feels that curiosity to push the button that we're not supposed to be pushed, we're going to see that in our eighth house. Or for someone who's rebelled against the social norms or wants to like go over to that dark corner and just see what's in there, like take a flashlight into the basement, we're going to see that in the eighth house. And we saw that beautifully in Tim Burton's chart as well, right? What was some form of alienation in this very normative town he grew up in becomes this incredibly beautiful gift of shining a light on the taboo. And that's given way to like decades of aesthetic and culture and sensibility that I think has really like stemmed from the work that he's done. So it is interesting to consider this aspect of other people in the eighth house. It's so much of what it's about, as that place where we begin tipping into night. As I mentioned, if we're going diurnally, it's not the first, I mean, there's people in all those other houses that come before, but it's the first one that's interpersonal, just between ourselves and another person. And this is an interesting way to consider how messy and confusing it can be, because then we progress to the seventh and we start to structure the thing that was confusing, or we start to try to make sense of whatever happened there in the eighth house, or perhaps give it like a container. And so as we begin to fall out of this linear organization of the day and realize that the night is coming in the eighth house, it's like a disorganization of our structure or an unraveling. But we're not actually in the night yet. And that's the discomfort of it. We're not truly in the night until we get to the sixth house, which is then under the horizon. So the discomfort of the eighth is that we're still in the light of day trying to organize something that is already unraveling. Something has started to spiral out of our hands. And as I mentioned, it has that quality of shame that can live there as well, because it's where that solar sense of self can begin to become disorganized. And that can carry some kind of inherent feeling of badness to it. Shame is also something that can live in those interpersonal spaces, in those confusing interpersonal ways that we encounter in the eighth house. So we often feel shame when we don't understand the things that happen relationally or where we had no control over them. So when we feel that we were bad or that we were wrong, it's primarily a way of making sense of a situation that is otherwise hard to make sense of. For people who have very strong eighth houses, shame can become a primary state of being or way of understanding the world as the individual starts to make sense of their disorienting experience. And it's also where we engage other people's energy and resources, as we said, and therefore where we can become lost in other people or feel and know things without context that we don't have any, clear way to point to. I know this thing, but I can't exactly tell you why. So this is why we also see the projections, the notions of monstrousness here that we mentioned, especially if the ruler of your eighth house is something very prominent or important in the chart, or that the residents of the eighth house are prominent and important in some way. Your sense of self is being defined now by a house that actually corresponds with other people. So some confusion and enmeshment can happen there as well. And for eighth house people, they're often left fielding the projections of others for this reason. It's like, is this mine? Is this yours? Things can get pinned on them, or perhaps they pin things on other people. It's disorienting to define what's what. And if we refer back to the myth that we looked at, there's that confusing sense of like, well, who's the real monster here? Like the projection can work both ways, depending on which perspective we're seeing it from. But there are many profound gifts that come from that relational space as well, though, such as in the pragmatic sense, we have accountants and bankers, grant writers who deal with other people's resources, who understand how to transfer things in this intelligent way. But we also get healers and counselors and therapists and magical practitioners who do so in more spiritual or ephemeral ways. People who thrive in those deep spaces of intimacy and shared experience. So there may be a setup for shame and projection here, but it's also where perception becomes a great empowerment of the eighth house, like Odysseus piercing through that singular eye to come to a conclusion. Perception is what allows us to see more clearly than that murkiness of shame that can live in the eighth. And validation and connection in our experience can create profound intimacy and love and empowerment in the eighth house as well, where that liminal space between ourselves and others actually becomes something incredibly loving and beautiful. So shame is a possibility, but so is initiation. And so is some of the deepest power that humans really have access to. As the entrance to the underworld, where all initiatory journeys into greater depth and capacity of the spirit really begin. So the eighth house can become a place of exquisite perception if we grow comfortable with its discomfort. It becomes perception, this ability to see what otherwise cannot be seen, to feel what is unspoken, to touch that deep or at times even dark space within others. See, I clicked the slide, but it seems to. Here we go. But the power of this also requires us to be willing to keep descending. And I think that some of the challenges of the eighth house arise when we want to be finished, when we want to keep everything fixed, when we want to stop the tipping point from occurring. The true power comes from accepting that there are always going to be circumstances beyond our control, and that loss and grief actually initiate us into deeper states of connection and love in our lives. So our power comes from accepting that we are always tipping, and the eighth house never stops descending. It never becomes a visible or fixed or secure place. It's not meant to be. And this is why, if we remember for Odysseus, it's some kind of collaborative effort with the monster that actually allows him out of the cave, rather than just to simply kill the monster in the first place. So being in a deep, intimate relationship with this kind of initiation will offer us a different experience than trying to control it or to overly define its unruly territory. Some additional considerations for your personal charts, or if you work with others, in your working with clients and their eighth houses. I think about what we would call the ruler of the eighth house, like the planet that rules the sign that is on the cusp of the eighth house. This is what I would call the guardian. And the guardian is responsible for tending the entrance to the underworld. So it is the guardian that discerns who and what enters the eighth house or enters that underworld place. Perhaps our guardian is sometimes too rigid, or perhaps it's too porous. And there are different challenges that can come out of both of those things. The guardian also protects the realm where we undergo our greatest initiations. So its sign, its place in the chart, and any aspects it's making tell us a lot about how and why and where these eighth house experiences occur. And then any planets or points that we have residing in the eighth house become the initiates themselves. They are the who and what that undergo the eighth house process. This is the aspect of self or of circumstance that is being initiated or enacted on us. So it can also describe people or circumstances in our lives that are transferred to us in that sort of way of transference, and how those become personal initiations into something else altogether. So I know we're just about at an hour, but I'm going to finish briefly with just another minute or two to look at the chart of the wonderful Audre Lorde and to apply some of these extra techniques that we've just gone over. So again, I'm sure most people know who Audre Lorde was, but in case you do not, she was a Black American queer feminist scholar and poet, very outspoken about her challenges with mental health, an activist and civil rights activist who was coming up in her career essentially during the Second World War and the civil rights movement in the US. she paved absolutely critical ground for many, many intersectional groups in what was otherwise a world predominantly occupied by straight white men at that time. So, she brought in a Black perspective, she brought in a queer perspective, the perspective of a woman, the perspective of someone who's struggling with her mental health. So she really had a very uphill battle herself, but was able to absolutely change the landscape of academia as she came into her work as a professor. So we see, of course, she's got the moon and Chiron in Taurus here in the 8th house. The moon squares a retrograde Venus and makes a trine to Neptune and a sextile to Mars as well. And then we can see that Chiron is squaring her sun and Saturn. So if we're to take this little mini theory that I've just given you with the guardian and the initiates, we would say, okay, Venus here in Aquarius rules her 8th house, and Venus is therefore the guardian of her underworld entrance. And we see Venus retrograde in Aquarius here in the 5th house, denoting her queerness, her psychiatric challenges, being a woman of color, the challenge to express herself and the darkness that she sees in the world, but the way that she also turns that into a creative pursuit, right? It's in the 5th house. So her Venus turns to poetry as a means of giving this, retrograde frustration a way to express itself, or perhaps a non-traditional voice. But she's still seen as monstrous in some way by those who in that era and in that time were still very ignorant and who didn't understand the profound wisdom that she was shining a candle into the darkness for. The initiate, we might say, is her moon in Taurus here in the 8th house. And that is applying to a square with the guardian Venus. Okay, so they're actually in relationship with one another. And we can say that the alienation she faced and these incredible uphill battles became a lifelong emotional initiation for her moon, describing that difficult emotional and psychological turmoil that was a part of her life. But it also describes her role in paving the way for civil rights, for women's rights, for queer rights. She became a professor and an academic in a world dominated by white men. And she also founded several organizations specifically supporting women and survivors of domestic gender-based violence. So we see her moon in Taurus using its own initiatory work at the edge of darkness, at the entrance to those underworld places, to hold a candle in that dark for others from a place of great care. And the applying square between the moon and Venus shows that her extreme efforts are again ultimately successful, as we saw with Tim Burton, shedding light on the matters of the 8th house where others are quietly struggling. So in conclusion, what I hope to have really been able to offer you today, and I'll leave Audrey's chart up here for a moment, is that the 8th house is a place where we are confronted by circumstance. It brings us out of that cohered order of the 9th into the tipping point of a greater journey, which we cannot yet see. And it is an entrance to something that lives below. And here we encounter what initiates us through fear, but also through connection, through loss, insight, and perception. And if we're able to allow that sense of self at the ascendant to peer into the darkness, or to have our regular vision obscured, we might discover something else about ourselves and our circumstance together. So thank you very, very much for taking this little journey with me. These are just a couple of the things that I have coming up. I'm giving a talk. It's a lunch talk at the UAC conference in September, a lunch talk on mythic houses. So we'll be doing a whole diurnal motion journey there. And speaking of diurnal motion, this is not yet announced, but I'm about to announce a program that I'm going to be teaching that starts early 2027 with the wonderful Jason Hawley. So if you're interested in that and you want to sign up for my mailing list, that's on my website here. We're going to be announcing that very, very soon.
Well, thank you, Aerin. That was an absolutely wonderful talk. I think everyone was completely spellbound, completely different approach to it from anything I've encountered before, which was super interesting. Thank you.